great to be here with Brandon Loran Maxwell. Yeah, is that how you say your name?
Yeah, Lauren.
Lauren, Brandon
Yeah,
Loran
it's a funny
Maxwell.
name.
I have a name which everybody butchers.
I imagine.
Ioan, no one gets that one. But anyway, Brandon is a writer I've been following for a while. Got a lot of interesting things to say about the United States, about the situation right now, about the history, about Chicano culture, about the gang situation, and about a lot of subjects. I've been following him, really like his perspective, really like his writing, and now he's got a full-on documentary feature film. So for anyone out there, this is not an easy thing to get out there. It's tough to get financing to get a whole documentary feature film, American Homeboy, premiering today, and then out on his channels. We'll send links to those. So first of all, before we get into the movie, Brandon, just say a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got into writing, and what kind of stuff you've been doing.
Well, I think my journey into writing was a little bit different than probably most people. I grew up, I was a little bit of a wild child, so I was involved in gangs growing up. Uh, did a lot of low riding, still do. And I love that aspect of it, but I was kind of a troublemaker growing up, and it really wasn't until after I dropped out of high school and I was talked back to going to school by my former principal that I fell in love with writing through a theater program. And you know, when I got out of jail a little bit later, I went to college and got a degree in political science and went over to DC and started writing for different publications. And I think that was where it really clicked to me that I could write and get published and probably write for a living. My degree ultimately was political science, and I never really left that afterwards. I talk politics, as you know, a lot, but I also love Chicano culture. I think and talk a lot about prison and gangs and kind of that side of things too, just from my own experiences. But yeah, that was kind of my foray into politics and writing.
Now, I watched the movie. It's a great film. Learned a lot of great images, a lot of great interviews, and storytelling. My sense is it's really a kind of celebration, an exploration, a kind of love letter to Chicano culture. Perhaps is the kind of. But how would you describe it? It's not primarily a gang movie, but obviously gangs are a feature of this. What would you describe the story being told and how this whole thing came about?
Yeah, I would say that the film in many ways is a love letter to Chicano culture. But it's also an analysis and at times a critique of Chicano culture. And I think that the culture in and of itself is much more complex than it appears on the surface. And I wanted to highlight the many different types of personalities that you find. I wanted to highlight many of the historical events, just kind of a broad overview of the different things that have kind of impacted the psyche of the people in that culture, that subculture. And so we talk about everything. We talk about low riding. We talk about a little bit of Cholo culture. We talk about the Sioux culture and Vietnam and World War II and how those played an impact. So yeah, I would say that overall though it's a broad overview of Chicano culture and the different lanes within that subculture.
I mean, a lot of people, everyone's gonna know elements of Chicano culture. I've seen kind of things about it. I mean, for me, I mean, in the UK, I learned about Chicano culture before Mexican culture, but because I listened, back in the day to like Kid Frost, and then saw
Yeah,
like American Me. So in fact, it was funny. I was even encouraged to learn Spanish. Funny enough, I was kind of like, that's kind of interesting. And before I came to Mexico and then learned, obviously very, very different Mexican culture and that kind of thing. But what would you say would the, how would you describe the elements of this Chicano culture? And you kind of looks a little, goes right back to, all the way back to people immigrating from the revolution through the World War II, Vietnam, and then obviously the 80s is this kind of real big explosion of this kind of more of that kind of cholo culture. But how would you describe where does this culture come from? What's the essence of this culture you're describing in this movie?
well, I feel like the culture is the culmination of a lot of different events over history, and it kind of was refined over time. What it was in the 40s when you look at Sioux culture, and kind of Pachucos that became Cholos, it was slightly different than it was in the 70s, and that was slightly different than what it was in the 80s and 90s. So it's changed a lot. But one thing I think is interesting is that, a lot of people, they think about the civil rights era when they think of the word Chicano. But as you see in the film, there's a lot of people using that word long before the civil rights movement. And the other interesting thing is that when you Google Chicano today, what do you get? You get the aesthetics, you get the low riding, you get the tattoos, you get all those things. And I think that over time, love it or hate it, that is what won out. The a lot of the politics that you found in the 60s and stuff is largely died out, and a lot of those movements don't have the foothold that they once did. But one thing that has lasted has been the low riding. It's been the tattoos, it's been the fashion, and the stilo kind of that comes with it. And so you can't really deny that. And I think that that's fascinating. And I'm equally fascinated by the fact that while not all Chicanos are cholos or identify as cholos, almost all cholos identify as Chicanos. And that's also something that you can't ignore. And so, I think one of the many interesting things about making this film was being able to talk to such a wide variety of people across academia, people who've been in prison, people who have been in gangs, people who were activists and academics, just kind of across the board to hear those different perspectives and experiences. But largely, that was kind of the takeaway.
Now, like, a lot of this Chicano culture, this Cholo culture as well, now seems in some way something which kind of reached a peak in the 80s, 90s. And then now you've got new things. I mean, now you've got obviously like the narco corrido stuff and the whole like buchon stuff. Like people in LA are also just like dressing like people in Sinaloa now with this whole like buchon culture and that kind of thing. On that side. And then maybe on the more I guess intellectual side, people using terms like Latinx and these kind of things, and that's been kind of
Don't get me started on Latinx.
Yeah, that's been knocked down a bit recently. But like, would you say that like that's true that kind of that Chicano Cholo thing flourished, or you'd say just now we're simply in a new latest chapter of that same continuation of that same culture in terms of like, what young people are like in the United States?
Well, I think that every generation does it slightly different, but I'm surprised by the longevity of the culture in general. But I almost feel like, and this was kind of a consensus in the film, that when you go to places like Japan, they're doing it better than they are in the US right now. Japan is very reminiscent of what you did see in the 80s and 90s from a style standpoint. Except they don't have a lot of the violence associated with it, like maybe you might find in the US. And I think the US is a lot better than it was in the 80s and 90s. I think you get two types of people who still kind of dress that style and that fashion, and you get people who grew up in the 80s and 90s, like me, and if they want to, they can. And then you have people, I think, who are just doing it for fashion. It's become fashionable. And so that is strange, though, to see people wearing Nike Cortezes and things like that for fashion when people used to get killed over those things. So in that sense, things are better than they used to be. But I think that it's always going to exist as a subculture. I see it everywhere. I mean, I see it all over LA still, San Jose, San Diego, Portland. I mean, they just sold out the lowrider show in Portland. Lowriding is still really big, which people say don't compare cholo culture and lowriding. And I agree they're two separate things, but there's overlap a lot of the times. And a lot of these things were still born out of the same era, right? You had lowriding and cholo culture kind of born out of that same frame of time. So you have these different tracks that were alongside each other in the same subculture. And so that's why these things get intertwined sometimes. But Idaho's doing lowrider shows, and I mean you can see it everywhere. So whether or not it's as prevalent as the 80s or 90s, I think it is, but it's probably slightly different. I think it's more commercialized than it used to be. So I don't know.
Getting into like some of the gang stuff, and I say that the movie is not primarily about gangs; it's about Chicano culture. But kind of, I do write about gangs and organized crime, and that's what I specialize in. So I'm kind of very interested. I know you have a lot of knowledge and you shot a lot of history about this. So the first thing, and one of the, quite touching moments in the movie is when you see somebody, older gang members who are kind of, one guy's breaking down in tears, sitting on a beach, and he's like saying, "I'm seeing a bunch of these kids, brought out to see the sea," and it's like, basically we didn't get that. And then other people talking about the kind of pain of going through the gang lifestyle. One of the things that strikes me as well, I've interviewed a lot of organized crime figures within Mexico and gangs across Latin America. What are the different things there? Is it right to say it's more like here it's a lot about money and really being part of very serious criminal organizations? Would that be the same thing there, or is a lot of it more about kind of identity and defending a neighborhood and that kind of thing? How do you describe that kind of gang lifestyle and also that emotion, though, some of them are feeling about, I don't know if they're feeling regret or not, like really how they look back about their lives in the gang lifestyle in the United States?
I think in the United States, when you look at least in the West, when you look a lot of those Mexican American gangs, I think so many of them were rooted in neighborhoods, community and family. They weren't formed to make money per se, right? And they weren't criminal in nature. Of course, there are always going to be people that commit crimes anywhere. But one of the interesting things I think about Mexican American gangs is that they transcend class. You can't blame poverty necessarily on gangs in the Mexican American community. They transcend generations. They're very generational, and they transcend centuries. Some of the earlier Mexican American gangs started in the late 1800s, now lasted both the Italian and Irish gangs at that time, and some of them are still going in the same neighborhoods, but they are named after their neighborhoods. So when you have a gang that's named after the neighborhood, and the neighborhood's the gang. So how do you get rid of that? And I think what has happened is, government has largely criminalized neighborhoods. And so, there's this concept called labeling theory, for example, in the criminal justice world. And when you call something enough, that's what they become. And so I think that while there's always people doing bad things, I think largely these neighborhoods, I think, began to engage in warfare by freeways getting cut up, by the crack epidemic, and by policies implemented by the U.S. government, such as rounding up zoot sitters during World War II. I think policies that kept people from hanging out together at gang injunctions, things like that. Because once somebody starts going through the system, generally it becomes a revolving door and you keep going back through the system. So it can be tough when you say, okay, well, you have a gang injunction, but the name of your gang is the neighborhood where you live. Or you say you can't hang out with another gang member, but your brother or your sister are from the same neighborhood and the gang is the neighborhood. What do you do at that point? You're guilty no matter what you're going to do. And so I think the vast majority of guys that I know weren't out to commit crimes or even make money. It was kind of a pride, just a lot of pride, whether it's related to family or community or neighborhood. And again, I think a lot of it, some of it has changed with drugs in the 80s and 90s. I'm not saying there aren't bad people. There's a reason why I walked away from it. But, there's a lot of guys also who have a sense of this history. They know the culture, where it came from. They're aware of the Mexican American War. They're aware of the Zoot Suit era and everything that they went through. And I think that's different than I think when you see gangs from other countries who don't have that same history. For them, when you could look at, I don't know, Central America, a lot of it is aesthetics. So they might adopt some of the aesthetics, but their history is different. They have a different story. Whereas Mexican Americans and then a lot of those poorer Irish, Jewish, Russian kids in those same neighborhoods, they have a different story in the U.S. And so the cultures can't be compared, even though they might look the same sometimes.
Now, like you said, like going back centuries, and I remember, looking around LA. The very first gang was like White Fence or something, the earliest I could find. But you look back to gangs before that, or even maybe a long time before that. So, what are the very earliest gangs? You know who they are and how the very first gangs came about?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are other guys, and there's a guys in our film who can talk more about this better than I can. But I think generally the consensus is that you had places like Alpine and Dogtown that were around in the late 1800s. And from my research, a lot of those neighborhoods were largely a mix of different youth that were all racialized, though. So, racialization was different back then. It wasn't just because you're black or you're Mexican per se. It was just being different. So you had people who accents, people who were um, different and racialized by Anglo-Saxons. And so, but over time, as the immigration increased, and those people had kids, then those first generation Mexican Americans tended to populate those neighborhoods, and so a lot of those earlier neighborhoods became predominantly Mexican American, and those gangs became predominantly Mexican American. But earlier on, you saw more Italians and Jewish and Russians and things like that. And I think the revolution in Mexico changed a lot because there was more immigration, and then of course World War II changed a lot with a lot of the policies during World War II. So
So now, like again, we talk about the kind of peak of maybe Cholo culture being the 80s, 90s. I mean, certainly when it kind of had a popular understanding and things like the movies like Blood In, Blood Out, and I think when you had an idea, there's a lot of cholos around, a lot of gang. Was that when there was a kind of peak of gang violence? Was it a lot like worse in terms of the number of bodies being dropped? And I know LA was a lot more violent back in the 80s, 90s than it is now. Yeah.
yeah, I think the US in general, a lot of those bigger cities were more violent. I think the 80s and 90s were the worst. I remember being a kid and having sawed-off shotguns pulled on me at 13, 14 years old from guys carrying them in their trench coats. And that was not abnormal. And so I don't really see that anymore. I know you see headlines here and there, kids toting big guns and stuff like that in Chicago, but I think it was a lot more prevalent back then. And I remember when people did have automatic weapons before they were harder to get, I guess. I'm not a big fan of necessarily governments cracking down on people's ability to own firearms, but I remember when they were a lot more accessible. Um, I think that I think it was New York City averaged almost 2,000 murders a year in the 80s. LA County averaged almost 2,000 murders a year in the 80s and early 90s. And I think right now our highest city is like Chicago is like 600 murders a year. So it's still bad. But I mean, when you think about it, that's crazy that we had multiple cities in the US that are doing triple that during the 80s and 90s. I mean, Portland led the nation in bank robberies in 88. And so
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
and I remember when those first gangs got exported out of LA into Portland. I mean, that's one of the stories that have always fascinated me, because they had such a foothold so early on. Nevada and Portland, a couple other states, and it's still there till this day. They took root and they're still there. And Portland worked really hard to kind of build this persona of microbreweries and coffee and keep Portland weird. But people forget that that was purposely created to get rid of the image of the 80s. And so now what you're seeing in Portland, that's the real Portland. That's the Portland that most people have already, have known about, except for the outsiders for a long time. And so none of what you see now in Portland surprises anybody who's ever lived in Portland.
Right. Okay. That's fascinating. So we talked about that before over, like about the rising in murders now and suddenly shooting up, but it has that background. Now, one thing that I've that you hear, I've been told by an active gang members in prison and various people is that one of the reasons that the violence went down among um the Mexican American gangs among the 18th Street in the United States, among various gangs there, was because of an enforcement itself of like banning drive-by shootings, and kind of trying to reduce violence there. Now,
Yeah.
is that true? And so you had quite powerful, I mean, like the Mexican mafia, quite powerful prison, organized crime, but also this kind of effort to control and reduce the violence in the United States, which is very interesting, and perhaps something that hasn't been that covered and that understood by the public.
Yeah, yeah. No, it is not something that's generally understood. I got a text from somebody, and they were talking to me about guns or drive-by shootings or something like that. And when I told them about how Mexican American gangs really don't do a lot of drive-by shootings and haven't for a long time, he was really surprised. It tends to be, and there's a lot of stats to back this up. Fights between Mexican American gangs tend to be a lot more personal. They tend to be fist fights and knives. Now you've seen a few incidences over the years where they kind of broke that standard, and I'm not saying people don't get shot, but yeah, it was definitely a huge push to change that in the 90s, and I think that dynamic has largely remained. I think a lot of the shootings and stuff you see, they're not being necessarily carried out by Mexican American gangs, and I still think that the vast majority of probably quote unquote gangs, Mexican American gangs in the U.S., most of those members aren't out committing crimes. Again, I think a lot of them they're out to party, they're out to fix up their cars, they're out to represent their neighborhood, because neighborhoods have such a strong pull in that community. Where you're from, where you're born, where you're raised, those types of things. And so, and again, I think that's also why you'll never probably stamp it out, because it's so intricately tied to history and to neighborhoods. They're different than what you see from other races and ethnicities. But it's easy to lump everybody together, but yeah, it is a little bit different. It's different from what you find in Mexico too.
So, I mean, Mexico, I've been here for 20 years and covering the violence here, and it's, the country's been destabilized. There's massacres and refugees and a lot of hurt. But one thing about the US, so kind of US is full of paradoxes in a way, that you have their very powerful organized crime as well, but it
Yeah.
doesn't destabilize the country in the same way. And one thing is, you don't see, I would say, gang members do things like like in Mexico, where they go to the I mean, first they'd have police on their payroll, but then they'd also go up to the police station and just attack the police station or kidnap a bunch of police. So how would you say that, like, within the US or the Mexican gangs, I mean, it's not as serious money as you were saying as well. It's not like billions of dollars trafficking drugs, and some of it's not even about money primarily. But how would you say that kind of idea of how gangs there or gang bangers there see like law enforcement, see how they would kind of fight the state in that way?
I don't know if I fully understand the question, but I think that if you see any of that type of thing, I think it's almost always tied to drugs.
Hmm.
So, of course, in any, like anyone, there are people that do drugs and sell drugs and buy drugs. And so, I mean, I know when I was involved in gangs, I mean, there were those homeboys that were involved in drugs. And then there's those homeboys who aren't. Those homeboys that just like partying. And then there's those homeboys that are just up for whatever at any time. So I think that you can definitely find plenty of guys who are involved in trafficking guns and drugs and things like that. But I think that those people largely would be doing it anyways. I'm not sure if it's because it's necessarily, to enrich the gang, as the government might put it, in a RICO Act.
Now, like, you have, so you've had this control in some ways, imposed or like put forward by, the Mexican mafia, and by the gangs themselves, have managed to reduce and control and kind of defend and discipline their neighborhoods. And also maybe, a bunch of other things. I mean, you've got, these neighborhoods have got, I guess, a lot wealthier than they were back in the 80s and 90s as well. More money around and various factors. Do you have any fear that this kind of level of violence could get a lot worse again? I mean, have you saw that massacre in, I pronounce it Goshen, California, where there was a family killed. I think members of the Nuestra Familia were involved, were accused of being involved in that. Do you have kind of fear this could break out, or are you confident this kind of level of violence is kind of a thing of the past now?
I think technology has changed a lot. I think that technology has given people access to information that they didn't have before. I think it's given people access to freedoms they didn't have before, and a level of comfort that people don't want to give up. I think that's one of the big underestimated impacts that has been had on gangs and gang culture and I think criminality has been technology. Um, People don't leave their homes like they used to, for one, but two, technology is comfy. I think people are less willing to just throw it all away. And I think you get access to different perspectives that you didn't have before, where people are saying, don't go join a gang. There's been really good nonprofit outreach. There's been a better understanding of our history. And so, I just think there's going to be a percentage of people who are always going to be criminal in some sense. I think there'll always be a percentage of people who do stupid things and then change. Maybe like me, I did a lot of stupid things growing up, and then I changed. And then there'll be a percentage of people who just never do anything. And so maybe you'll get flare-ups here and there. I think that probably some of the younger kids that are doing bad things are driven more by money than my generation was, and less by gang ties. I see a lot of people who aren't actual gang members, but they kind of play the part and they're out doing bad things. And so, again, I think it goes back to that history in that neighborhood and how closely tied you actually are to it. So I think that there's some issues with the younger generation, and I think people want to make money, but I'm not sure it's always linked to real gangs like maybe the government might try to make it, per se. And I'm not saying gangs are great. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just trying to contextualize the thought process, I think, behind a lot of people who are involved in gangs.
Okay,
it's hard to with a broad brush.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Getting back into the culture a bit and the movie itself, as we finish off here. One of the things I liked about it is, it had a very raw, working class kind of vision of the culture. Is that, and you say, you're saying, before we brushed on like Latinx. Would you see that as being a much more kind of using the word bourgeois kind of vision of the culture, that kind of new Latinx thing, and what you're doing is kind of showing a bit more returning to the roots of what this culture is, and just kind of showing this kind of pride in neighborhoods and what kind of these kind of regular kids are into, or how do you see that kind of playing out, the kind of dynamics playing out there?
Yeah, well, I think words like Latinx are things that are being forced onto the community for political purposes. I think the term comes with a lot of political connotations that people may or may not agree with. And I think that you'd be hard pressed to go to a lowrider show, to go to an art show, to go to a taco stand and ever find anybody who uses that term. And if you were to explain that term with them, they'd probably laugh you out of the place. It's mainly only used in academia and media. And I think at this point, it's just a calling signal to other people who politically agree with you. But I think doesn't have a lot of substance to it. There's already terms that are gender neutral. The word Mexican is gender neutral. All you got to do is be specific about who you're talking about. Mexican American is gender neutral. Central American is gender neutral. So to me, it's all about politics. I think that what they want to do is they want to treat Latinos like they're one giant political block. That's their dream. Put everybody into a box and then get everybody to vote the way you want them to vote. But I think the Latino community is a lot more nuanced than that, especially the Mexican community. And good luck getting everybody into a box. I think about 3% of people use the word Latinx, and it's been around since 2014 or so. So it's very little traction over 6, 7, 8 years. I've never seen a march where people are marching for Latinx culture. I don't even know what Latinx culture is. Was that like listening to Bad Bunny? I don't know what that means. There is no subcultures associated with Latinx. But when you say the word Chicano, that has meaning to a lot of people. They marched with that term. Lowriding is part of that. The art is part of that. There's a lot of subcultures associated with that that are deep and embedded in history and have a lot of meaning to people. So I don't see that ever going away. I think Latinx is just kind of the fling of the moment, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
I've got a funny bit of tape I can play you sometime, which is an interview with quite a significant drug trafficker, Mexican American, and very, very much from the border. And asked, how he identified himself and had he heard of Latinx, and he was like, I never heard of that term, but for me that means like Latin people are nothing, because it's like Latin X, like he's thinking more the Mexican, like your X.
Oh, yeah.
So it's kind of funny. It's kind of funny how they,
Yeah.
but like, well, look, great movie. Where can people, see the movie, and how are you promoting this? Where's it going out? How can they find this and find your work?
So, well, you can follow me on my Twitter, Brandon Loran Maxwell. It's Brandon L Maxwell at Twitter, and that's also my Instagram. The film is playing in select theaters this month and next month. We keep adding new theaters. Remember, we started with just a project that we were going to put online, and it's been picked up in 10 cities. So we didn't plan for any of this. We're playing catch up at this point. And so we're always adding new cities. On September 14th, we're going to make it available on the app, Daily Chela TV app. And so you can download it and watch the film then if you can't catch it in a theater. So it's called American Homeboy. You can find more information at americanhomeboy.com.
That's great. It's picked up. Well, I mean, was there a specific kind of audience you're building on, certain cities that are really blowing up, or how's this thing, man? How did it come about, and how's this thing really starting to blow up like this?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was tough to make to begin with. I mean, as you've seen the film, so you saw there's a lot of archival footage in it, and that archival footage is not easy to come by, and it's not easy to get the rights to, and it's not easy to restore because a lot of it is old. And so it took us 3 years, and it took 3 years to work out all the interviews because it's not easy to get everybody to sit down either. And we did 3 or 4 hour interviews with everybody in the film. So there's 20 terabytes of footage that I edited the film with. So there's a lot of stuff that people haven't seen, and maybe one day we'll put that out. But, the film, it took off with the trailer. Obviously, I think the trailer excited a lot of people. We were just going to do a premiere and then put it on the website. But after that, we started hearing from places, universities, theaters, things like that, that I think were interested in the history aspect. And so we have been going ever since. And now I think we're in 10 cities. We just picked up Sacramento. We're trying to add another date in LA because that we could probably sell out every show in LA for a week. And so we can't keep up with demand in LA, but we've done well. Even in Portland, that show is going to sell out. And we are going to sell out the show in Tucson. And so it's become, I'm glad to hear that you view it as a celebration of the culture, because I think that's what a lot of people want it to be. And people are, I've already made it, so I got to live and die with whatever I've made, but I didn't plan on people being this excited for it. And I think that, I tried to at least get some different perspectives. That's why I had Richard in it. And I think I tried to treat him fairly. And I like Richard. He was great for sitting down with us, and it's not easy to be the only law enforcement officer in that film. And I think it was just, generally speaking, I think it was wonderful hearing all these different perspectives, because it's so hard to get, because everybody's busy. You got to get everybody into a location to film, and so just to be able to get these different perspectives, and some of these guys won't be here in 10 years. And so I think it's great to have this as part of the record, I guess, in history. For the community. But I also hope that people take away and ask themselves, can we have the culture without the violence? Because, that question kind of does get posed in the film. And I think that we can. And so I think that ultimately that's the goal, because like I said, there's a reason I walked away from the gang world. And so I'd like to see us not fight each other. So
well, there it is. I put links below as well. And check it out. American Homeboy. If you can get to see it in a cinema, that'll look great on the big screen. The archive footage is, it's amazing. I'm a big fan of archive. I made a TV series about Chileno Sanchez, which is on VIX. You can see that, and a lot of work getting archive for that. I know how hard it is getting and licensing archive. So now you must have a real kind of collection, kind of be a bit of a special historic archive now of Chicano culture, and that you have there now.
Yeah, about 20 terabytes. Yeah. And you know what's crazy is I a union editor wanted 9 months to edit that film because of all the archival footage. And so I opted to do it myself in 90 days. So I started on January 1st and then I did 90 days straight every day editing. I worked my day job and then I went in at 9 p.m. and I edited till 2 a.m. And so
Wow.
my first day off was March. And so
You had another
that was
editor
nice.
with you? You had another editor with you helping you do stuff, or was
No,
just
it was just me. And
okay, man?
so yeah, it was something. Let me tell you, to go to 20 terabytes of footage, anybody knows computers, that's a lot. It's a lot of footage. None of it was labeled. And I had 90 days because we were already booked in the theaters before I'd edited it. And so there's also with that, in the back of your mind being like, oh man, we got picked up by theaters and I haven't even edited the movie yet. And so I had I had to do it in 90 days. And I just had to live with whatever came out of it. But I'm glad that people so far have given me good feedback because it could have gone terribly awry had I not had experience or a background in editing, video editing. So fortunately, I do.